Glad to have you here with us on this Wednesday, June 28th. I'm Chip Chapman, Andy Santoro back in just a few minutes. Right now, we're going to spend a few minutes with our money guy, Chris Hoipkins. Chris, with Apogee Wealth Partners, and hopefully, Chris, you'll be able to make some sense out of this suspension of the U.S. debt ceiling. First of all, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, good morning, Chip.
What did all this exactly mean when the President and the House Speaker came to this agreement to suspend the debt ceiling?
Right. So we have a kind of a weird situation here in the United States, the only Western country really that has a statutory limit on how much we can borrow. So we have two stages. We pass a budget and our spending bills, and then we have to authorize the additional borrowing. So when we hit that ceiling a couple months ago, if we didn't raise it by act of Congress, the Treasury couldn't borrow money to finance the debt. We would stop sending out Social Security checks, in other words. So they did finally reach an agreement to raise that debt ceiling for the next 2 years.
What else is considered discretionary spending?
Sure, and that's part of the problem, that only about a quarter of our spending, a little over a quarter, is considered discretionary, which means Congress authorizes it each year. That's stuff like military spending. It's the EPA, it's the Education Department. Almost 3/4 of our total spending is automatic. Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, and more importantly, interest on the national debt, which is now about 10% of our total spending. That is not discretionary.
Does that action have any impact here on us locally? For example, Hamilton County Schools.
Absolutely. It has an impact on each family in the United States for a couple of reasons. One thing is this tremendous debt we have. The public part of the national debt's almost $25 trillion. That crowds out other borrowing in the market, so it drives up interest rates, for example. It's one of the reasons, not the only one of the reasons that mortgage rates have risen. Recently, they're going to rise more as the government has to borrow more and more money to cover this debt. So it impacts families directly. It's going to impact school budgets. It's going to impact revenue at the city level. And ultimately, at some point in time, if our debt gets big enough, it's going to impact the value of the dollar. Because so much of the world relies on the dollar because they assume the United States will always pay its bills. If we get to the point where we can't, then we're in trouble with the dollar.
Then we're in big trouble, not just here, but elsewhere in the world.
Right.
The Financial Responsibility Act, or the Fiscal Responsibility Act, boil this down into stuff that most of us can understand, because a lot of these figures, when you get 13 zeros on them, they're over.
They're meaningless. So let's think in terms of the total percent of the economy. 20 years ago, our total debt was about 50% of the size of the economy. Think about our household budget. Your total debt is basically half of your annual income. Now it's 100%. It's doubled in 20 years. So what the Fiscal Responsibility Act did is in exchange for raising the debt ceiling, it limited the growth in federal spending for the next 10 years. The problem is it only deals with that discretionary part, and it's only going to reduce the growth in the national debt over the next 10 years by about 2 or 3% of GDP. It's almost not measurable. It is so small compared to the total debt.
But you ask retirees or folks in the military, things of that nature, that money's not discretionary.
Not to them, it isn't. That's right. So one of the things we're going to have to think about over the next 30 or 40 years is how do we change the trajectory of these mandatory spending programs going forward. And frankly, nobody really wants to talk about this, but we're also going to have to talk about how do we pay for it. We're spending 24% of GDP every year, but we're only raising 18% of GDP in tax revenues. You got to close that gap somehow. You can't close it all by reducing spending. Some of it is going to have to be more revenue.
Where do you see this going in 5 years?
I wish I could be optimistic. I think 5 years from now we're going to be having the same discussion, only it's going to be 120% of GDP instead of 100. Because if we look back, we had a chance to deal with this 15 years ago with what was called the Bowles-Simpson plan, and we got this close and Congress wouldn't take it up. So unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic. I think it's going to require, as it often does, the verge of a financial crisis of some kind to get us to move on it. And frankly, it's going to require some political courage.
And a lot of times the economy goes through cycles like this where you hear of this in the news, and
right.
a lot of times people just say, well, it's going to work itself out. One of these days it might not.
Right. We keep putting it off right now. So we've passed the Fiscal Responsibility Act. We've kicked the can 2 years down the road, right? We're going to have this discussion again, only the problem is going to be bigger.
All right, you said this will affect housing as interest rates have already increased. Where do you see that going as it pertains to us here in Chattanooga and the surrounding areas?
Sure. I think in the short term we're going to see a bit of a slowing in the housing market, but I think the important thing to remember is we are still remarkably underbuilt. No matter how much you look around, how many sticks are going up, we still don't have enough units to satisfy the demand in Chattanooga and nationwide too. We've been underbuilding since the great financial crisis. So supply of housing is still scarce. We're going to see probably fairly tight housing market going forward for at least the next year or two. We're starting to see prices level off and come down a little bit, but demand really hasn't slowed that much because of the additional cost of financing. So I think the housing market is likely to remain relatively strong.
Wow. At least there is some good news, and thanks so much, Chris Hoipkins, for making some sense out of all this, which sometimes it's hard to do and takes an expert like you. You can get in touch with Chris Hoipkins at Apogee Wealth Partners. Again, that's Apogee Wealth Partners. The number is there on your screen, and the website, apogeewp.com. That's apogeewp.com. Chris Hoipkins, thanks again.
Thank you, Chip.
As always. We thank you for joining us. We are back with more of Let's Chat after this.